Dr. Starcher, I'm having some problems. My camera is backward instead of forward, and so you can't see me, but I can see you.
Okay. No worries. We can hear you.
Okay, okay. Basically, I did not grow up in Boise, Idaho, but where I did grow up, as I indicated last week, was a place called Lake Providence, Louisiana, and there I experienced racism all my life. Um, it was a place in the rural South, and basically uh, Black people could not attend movie theaters unless they sit in the balcony. They couldn't drink at the same water fountains that other people were drinking at. Uh, and then in addition to that, if I moved to, and Black people were being killed even then by the police. I can think of two instances. One instance where a Black male who was in high school, 12th grade, was being transported in a police car. He had cuffs on, and he was found dead in a tunnel. They said that he had escaped, and he was killed in a tunnel. And then another instance where the police really they solved cases when it came to white people who were criminalized, but there was a African American female who actually was found dead in a white part of town, and to this day, that has not been solved. That case has not been solved. So that's basically some of the things that happened while I was growing up.
Michael, thanks. And I don't want to, my grandmother would hesitate. She would probably slap me if I asked you how old you are. Michael, how old are you?
I am 60.
So this is 1960s, 1970s when you're growing up. And even after the civil rights movement, you are still using different water fountains, going to different movie theaters, is that correct?
Yes.
See, even Dr. Kevin is learning something about America. Michael, tell us what that was like for you and your peers just growing up. Did that feel normal? Did that feel, what was that like just as a child?
Well, it was like I was living in two different places. I was one person. I was a citizen, but I was not really being treated as though I was equal. I was not being treated as though I was a person who mattered, like a human being.
And you are 5, 10 years old at this time?
Yes.
How has that childhood experience affected who you are today?
Well, it showed me what it meant to be Black in America. That's number one. And number two, it showed me how people view African Americans. As I stated last time when I was with you all, when we went into a store, people would follow us. And they did that because Black people were always under suspicion. And I believe that still happens even today, especially with racial profiling, as well as even with Oprah Winfrey. If you remember, when she was in another country, she went into a store and something similar happened to her. So with someone who has economic means, it still happens.
And here's just a question that I think a lot of us white folks might be having. Do you think that that has improved over the past 50 years? Or does a lot, not even a little, a lot, like tell us how that has shifted, if at all?
Yes, I do think it has improved, but in a way it shifted to versus Jim Crow. There's a new Jim Crow, right? And so basically, number one, as all of us know, a few years back we had our first African-American president. So that was a positive. And then even since then, even before then and since then, you have a lot of Black people in positions as mayors, governors, and other political positions, as well as positions in corporate America that would never be there now had it not been for the civil rights movement and things of that nature. So it has improved. However, there is a such thing as systemic racism that exists. And basically, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I was watching something earlier today, and 11 hours ago, there was a report made from Los Angeles that some police officers in Los Angeles was placing names of individuals that were Black inside a gang database. And the reason why they were doing that was because, not because the people were gang members, but they were incentivized based on promotions, based on the things that they would get as a result. Now, that happened a few hours ago. So that shows you things are still happening. Systemic racism keeps people down, and then it allows other people to prosper while other people are not. For example, the criminal justice system. You have many African Americans in jail or in prison, and one of the reasons why they're in prison is because of, and if you look at it, it's because of drug-related crime. Many times it's basically using the drugs, not necessarily even selling the drugs. But when that happened within the Black community, they called it a war on drugs. But let's bring it up to today. Today there was an opioid problem. They said that was a disease, but in the Black community, this is seen as a war on drugs. So you can see the disparity there. Then in addition to that, you have more Black people incarcerated than any other people. And Black people are only about 12 or 13% of the population. And then even when we got rid of slavery, we still found ways to place Black people in positions where they had to work, or they had to work for other people for nothing. For an example, they put laws out so that those people would get put in jail. If you didn't have a job, it was against the law. And so therefore you went to jail just because you didn't have a job. And so then when you got to jail, guess what? They put you on plantation. So they still had you. So when people do not have economic power, they do not have power, period. And from our perspective, we have to enter into the white world. We have to be educated. We have to get jobs. We have to go to school, right? But for the most part, white people never really have to enter into the Black world. So there are disparities in the criminal justice system. There's disparities on TV. when you look at how things are communicated. For an example, when a Black person commits a crime, you see the picture posted all over the TV set. And then they talk about it in a certain way, you know, like he did this or whatever. Sometimes when a white person commits a crime, you don't even see a picture at all. And they don't talk about it in the same way. So we have disparities in housing. At one point, they started what's called redlining, making sure that Black people were in places and so that they could not go to other places as well. They kept the Black person down. So even though we live in America, we live based on a different standard than everybody else.
Michael, thanks for getting us into this idea of systemic racism. And again, if there's anyone in the audience here that has a question or online, do feel free to type that into the chat room. We'll give Michael an opportunity to respond. But systemic racism, thank you for bringing that up. And I just want to be clear that this idea of racism that exists structurally in abstract policies, economic structures, laws, it doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, if Kevin believes in systemic racism, I must believe that some people are blatantly racist and don't like Michael for the color of his skin. No, but I do believe that Michael has pointed out some very specific realities of the world in which we live that disproportionately affect our sisters and brothers of dark skin. Any questions or comments or, and again, this is a time of learning, so you're welcome to ask a question and at least push back to me. I'm going to ask you not to push back to our guests. But systemic racism, I have a photo that I want to share with you that I think is a terrific example of systemic racism. We'll see if I can do my share screen here, and we will throw that up there. Does everyone see that at home? This is from a newspaper just a little over 2 weeks ago. It's the front page. The minor headline on the left says a 19-year-old is arrested for a Tuesday homicide. And you get a small picture of a 19-year-old white man. Beneath that, you have a headline of a deputy and ex-constable killed in the line of duty. But it's not the headline of this paper in the South. The major article is police arrest a burglary suspect. And we get this very large picture of a young African-American. Now, this is just another newspaper in the day of a life of America, right? But do you see what our sisters and brothers of color are thinking about when they talk about systemic racism? Not even these policies, but unconscious perspectives that the folks who control the world throw out in the media. You know, we have a homicide suspect arrested who's a white guy, but he's the small picture. What sells the newspaper is the picture of a young African-American male. And I have so many friends who say this is the problem, that it's always we want to point to the black guy is the problem for everything that's happening. Michael, am I talking too much? Do you want to speak to that? You're welcome to disagree with me too. I
agree with you 100%. That article that you just showed is a prime example. There are other things even on that same page that to me would be more of a headline, but yet still you want to show a large picture of an African American that's 19 years old that was arrested for homicide. I'm wondering if that person had been white, would they have done that? Right. No, it's a good question that I think our friends who are asking these questions of systemic unconscious racism that happens in Americans, I think this is like a terrific example because it's just a normal newspaper headline, right? Came out 2 weeks ago in the United States, but is a terrific example of what sells newspapers. What are we afraid of?
Has anyone heard of what happened in New York City just hours before George Floyd was killed? There, I see one hand. Amy Cooper is a 40-year-old white woman walking her dog in the bird watching section, the rambling section of Central Park. In this space of the park, you keep your dog on a leash because people are trying to watch birds, right? Christian Cooper, African-American male of no relation, asks the woman to please put her dog on the leash so he can go back to watching his birds. Michael Cooper is a Harvard-educated scientist, journalist who writes for Science Magazine. He comes with a terrific pedigree. Forgive like the stereotypical language, like he's not a thug. Like in some ways, he's an educated man just like me and you, going out to look at birds. Well, woman overreacts. Says, what are you going to do about my dog? You get away from me. This is the point where Christian pulls out his cell phone to capture a microaggression that is often experienced by our sisters and brothers in color, and just starts videotaping this woman. She feels threatened by this black man. I'm going to call the police on a man who has asked her to follow the rules, calls the police and says an African-American man pulling out the race card, like what gets us going as white folks. I feel threatened by this black man. He's threatening my life. Please send the cops immediately. Thank God he takes this, because it is a terrific example of these microaggressions that happen, because I think, forgive me, that consciously, unconsciously, we have been trained by the media, by the society, that the black man is a threat. And Michael, feel free to interject at any point, and I'm going a long time, right? Christian Cooper has been an amazing child of God. I don't even know if he's Christian, right? He de-escalates the situation. They both leave before the cops ever come. He's not going to make a big deal out of it because he thinks, oh, this is just my experience as a black man in America, another normal ho-hum day in paradise. But his sister catches hold of it and says, the world needs to see this. It blows up. Amy Cooper loses her job. Her life has been destroyed. She issues an apology. New York City police are opening up an investigation into her. Christian Cooper says, I'm not going to cooperate. This woman's life has already been destroyed. I don't know if she's racist or not, but we have shown a picture of what it's like to be a black man. You know, white privilege. I was that poor kid from West Virginia, but I have never experienced people being afraid of me for the color of my skin. I see some heads nodding in the audience. Michael, do you want to respond to that at all?
And also, Kevin, recently, within the last week, they came out and indicated that they were going to police, that they were going to charge Amy with filing a false report.
Yeah, I've been following this Christian Cooper recently. He blows me away with his integrity and his willingness to teach America in a moment where he could really exploit this, I think, and say shame on you, and it'll do serious damage to the woman, but he's choosing not to. Just an incredible person of integrity. Michael, I see a question from our friend Billy Weinstein on the chat. She writes, we just saw Asheville, North Carolina pass a law agreeing to some reparations for Black Americans. What do you think would be the most effective form of reparations?
If we're only talking about reparations alone, I would say we need to give African Americans some type of economic boost, because I think that if you do not have economic power, you don't have power, period. And so therefore, that's one of the reasons why you got these large crime rates in ghetto areas like that, right? So basically, again, uh, if we don't do anything to improve the economic part of the race, then I don't think that nothing else is really going to matter. As far as reparations,
I sent out a link to a video just this afternoon. I've seen it going around, and I finally said, I think I just need to share this with my folks. It could be good homework. Was anyone able to watch that video that I sent out just this afternoon? The teacher sent it out too late. Go home and watch that. It's 17 minutes, but it talks about this idea of systemic racism and gets into what Michael is sharing. And the statistic is, as we talk about economic power and mobility, that the average African-American household in the United States has a fraction of the wealth of the average white household in the United States. We might say it's a half. Oh, that would be pretty considerable, right? But would you know that the actual statistic is that the average African-American household has 1/10 the accumulated wealth of the average white household. This accounts for all the rich folks of whatever color your skin, all those poor white folks back in West Virginia. On the whole, the average African-American household has 1/10 of the wealth. And what does this wealth do? It sends people to college. This household wealth means that maybe your kids don't need to sell drugs to put food on the table. I mean, we're seeing this more and more in the white folks in West Virginia, right? Drug dealing is an economically viable thing to support your family when there is nothing else, nowhere else to work. But we've criminalized that. And you heard Michael say, oh, with the white folks, we're learning a little more that maybe now this is a health problem. But do you know what we did with drugs in total in the 1980s? We said this is a criminal problem. And as we speak just on averages between the average African-American household, the average white American household, I have a son named Levi. The statistics for a newborn white child going to jail in the United States is 1 in 23, based upon largely a lot of those economic variables, right? Do you know what the statistic is for the average African-American young man born, the Levi equivalent, in the United States being incarcerated at their point in the United States today? For my son, Levi, it's 1 in 23. For the average African-American child, 1 in 4. And I don't think it's because some people whose skin is darker than ours choose to be criminals, right? There's something larger at work here. And I would dare say that for Christians, we call that spirit that's not necessarily manifested in one individual, but maybe in bigger structures in place in society, we call that sin. And I believe that Jesus Christ calls all of us, regardless of the color of our skin, to work for justice for all of God's children. And when we limit that, I believe that we blaspheme the work of our Lord. I'm getting a little preachy and I see some more questions. Michael, do you want to say anything better to that? You will.
No, I concur with you 100%. I just think that, more people need to be awakened to what is actually transpiring to Black people in America. I think that with George Floyd's death and actually physically seeing something like that on TV because of the video that was taken, if the video had not been taken, people would think that that didn't happen. But even with the video being taken, we still have people who are looking at George Floyd's criminal record as opposed to looking at what actually happened to him while he was being arrested, in which he lost his life and called for his mother. They're looking at, well, he was a criminal. He was being arrested. He was forging a check or something of that nature. Even if that's true, did that behavior necessitate him dying for it? Did Rayshard Brooks's behavior of getting drunk and passing out in a car at a Wendy's necessitate him dying for it? Did Breonna Taylor sleeping in her own house and the police have a no-knock warrant and they come to the house and knock the door in and her boyfriend shoots one of them in the leg and then they return the shot with 20 shots, of which 8 entered into her body? Did that necessitate her dying? And then they come to find out the person that they were really looking for was already incarcerated. Yeah. So did it really necessitate? Does being Black really necessitate this stuff?
Yeah. Another, I think, example of what Michael's talking about. I want to read this to the group. He mentioned Breonna Taylor. Perhaps you're familiar with the story. I think it's terrible tragedy of American injustice. An example of what our friends of color are dealing with. If you don't know that story, go look it up. The phrase is read it and weep, right? Read it and weep. The young lady served her community. Those officers that utilize that no-knock search warrant into someone's house that is their domain, wherever they were protecting themselves, those officers haven't been arrested or charged. And there's been some demonstrations in Louisville, and some of you know I did some of my seminary work in Louisville, Kentucky. So news from Kentucky, systemic racism. On May 24th, several hundred protesters stood on the porch of the Kentucky governor's mansion, many of which were armed with rifles, demanding for him to come outside. And this took place for nearly 2 hours, beating on the glass windows of his home. And this same group later hung an effigy and burned this effigy of Governor Beshear from a tree. This group was primarily made of middle-aged white males, and they were protesting over COVID-19 restrictions. In response to this protest in Kentucky, they are now building a fence around the governor's mansion. 0 arrests were made. Now, on July 14th, 87 protesters sat in the front lawn of Attorney General Daniel Cameron's house in Louisville, Kentucky. They were sitting in lines with their hands in their laps. This group is unarmed and made up of mostly young people, both of white and of color, who are demanding justice for Breonna Taylor. Other than his grass, no part of the Attorney General's home was touched. All 87 were arrested and charged with a felony. They face a sentence of 1 to 5 years. These are the things we need to be considering as we talk about systemic racism today.
And it's important, Kevin, for us to also realize that in order for things to change, there needs to be a disruption. For example, during the Civil Rights Movement, when Martin Luther King Jr. led the Civil Rights Movement, they had sit-ins, they had protests, they had marches, right? And it was really non-violent. But the issue behind it was they were disrupting something in order to show people what really was happening. And it wasn't until they went to Birmingham, Alabama, and they were hosed down children, older people, and treated the way that they were treated, that actually something happened as a result. So without the protest, without the rallies, without the demonstrations, without the sit-ins, there would be no attention brought to the issue. For example, a lot of people talk about Black Lives Matter. Well, the truth of the matter is, if Black Lives Matter had not formed and had not started in 2015 to put on a national level what was actually happening with police and Black people, even to this day, it still would not be known. So if you want to give them credit for anything, give them credit for making it known on a national basis, not a local basis, but a national basis, that this was going on with Black people. Will Smith, who's an actor, said not too long ago that what has been happening with George Floyd has been happening all along. The difference now is it's being videotaped.
Deserves a good little pause. The difference now is that it's just being videotaped. Michael, you mentioned the group Black Lives Matter. And I want to be very clear with my congregation. And I've shared with Michael, I serve a very purple congregation. There are liberals, there are conservatives, and I'm really grateful that we keep our eyes on Jesus and we don't. I'm not a super hot political preacher, but I want to be clear. Black Lives Matter. Now we can, Black Lives, period. Jesus leaves the 99 to go after the one sheep. And our sisters and brothers of color are pointing out the injustices that they face and have faced and saying, look, folks, we need to bring some attention to this. And friends, if Black lives don't matter, then no lives matter. And the counter argument is all lives matter. And I've never heard any of our sisters and brothers of color say all lives don't matter. Never heard that. But it's our sisters and brothers of color who are hurting and calling out, saying, we need some justice. That what we say on paper in the Constitution is true. So I want to be very clear as your pastor. It's not a political statement. It really is a Jesus statement. Because if we neglect the sins that are being experienced by our brothers and sisters in Christ, it's sin. Period. Let me be loud and clear. Michael, I see a question on the chat box, and I don't know this handle, but the question is systemic racism, is that situation any better in Boise? How do we compare to other parts of the states?
I believe systemic racism exists here as well. In fact, I believe it exists everywhere. In Boise, I would say that in terms of employment, I know for a fact that there have been Black individuals who were qualified for positions. In fact, they were even told that they were. However, when they go against a white candidate, then in every situation, the white candidate is going to get the job versus them. There have been Black people who've been looked over for positions because they are Black here in this area. So it exists. It's hard to grow up and not to be conditioned by your environment. It's hard when you really don't come into contact with a whole lot of Black people and you don't have a whole lot of Black friends to not have a stereotype based on watching Fox News or watching what people say about Black people in general without really knowing Black people. But I would say it exists here. It exists in every aspect of it. It exists in the housing market. You know, in order to many Black people here in Boise, as opposed to a place like Oakland, they came here because of a job like at Micron or a job at HP, or they may have come here as a result of the service, or they may come here as a result of going to Boise State University or something like that, right? But so those people, they have, for the most part, economic means so that they can live in certain places. I have been living in the community in which I've been living in for the last almost 20 years, right? But the truth of the matter is, when you don't have the economic means, that's a different story. So that's going to dictate where you're going to live. That's going to dictate the decisions that you make in your life.
Indeed. Economic mobility, the power of like choice with where you live, what you eat, where you go and shop. Think about these abstract things that are very real in our lives. Economic mobility is incredibly. Yes, sir.
As it relates to Black Lives Matter, okay, I believe, like most all Black people, that all lives matter. And biblically speaking, all lives matter. But that was a great illustration of this that was given. One man said that if a house was burning on your block, and that house was owned by a Black person, and the fire department came and they started putting water on all of the other houses versus that one, that's an illustration of really what's happening. See, what's really happening is right now, Black lives are the ones that are being taken. And so therefore, the reason why they say Black Lives Matter is because right now, those are the ones who are majorly being taken. So therefore, something needs to be done. Now, if it was Hispanic lives, if it was white lives, if it was Asian lives, or whatever else, then it would be Asian Lives Matter or White Lives Matter or whatever. But because it's Black lives, that's the reason why they say Black Lives Matter.
Amen. Thank you for that terrific illustration, Michael. I want to bring up something that I hear as a pastor of a white congregation from some of our folks. And I answer it very pastorally. But I want to throw it out for Michael and appreciate an honest answer. I hear from some good folks that say, I believe in the cause of Black Lives Matter. I can't get past the destruction and violence that happens in these protests. Now I have my answer, but I'm wondering what you have to say about that, Michael.
I'm going to be honest with you. In every group, you're going to have your 10%. Then in addition to that, it has been reported that many people from different cities travel to where those protests are being held, and then they join the protest in order to cause some problems so that people can see the protesters in a certain way, in a negative way. I don't agree with looting. I don't agree with stealing. I think that is taken away. And if you really realize what the major place that it was really being done, it was really being done in the Black community. So in reality, they were hurting Black people the most, you know. But I don't agree with it no matter who they are hurting, whether or not it's white people, Black people, Asian people, or Pacific Islanders. What I do believe is that, again, I believe in protests. I believe that we should be able to exercise our our First Amendment rights. I believe that as long as it's done in a peaceable manner, that there's nothing wrong with that. And I'm a firm believer that we, let me use a phrase that I grew up with that you all may not be familiar with. My mother used to tell me, you can catch more flies with honey. And I think translated, what that really means is, I think that if we use the right method to bring this to people's attention in terms of the injustice, the inhumane way that Black people are being treated and still being treated, in terms of the inequality that Black people are faced with. If we use the right method, for example, Martin Luther King Jr., to me, he used the right method. It was nonviolence. And that really shows that we're not trying to destroy people. We're not trying to hurt people. We're just trying to show people that we're human beings, that we deserve, if we are citizens of the United States, we should have the same rights as anybody else. We should be treated just like anybody else. But that's not the case in America.
Do we hear this, my friends? A fellow servant of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has given his life to the gospel, who says even today, he still feels like the people with his skin color are not being treated like everyone else. Did we hear that? I see some heads nodding. Michael, thank you. Here's my response when folks talk about the demonstrations. I have a lot of first degree folks who went down and protested, friends in my circle that I know support. Kevin, the pastor, is just too scared of COVID-19 to really do anything these days. But here's what I hear. The protests in Boise, peaceful. Sure, there was a little bit of damage caused by some teenagers. Did you know that there were shots fired at the protests? A young man's of white skin color, 18 years old, who brings his automatic assault weapon to make sure that it's a peaceful march, accidentally discharges his weapon into the ground. We have a good police department that was on top of that, quickly arrested him. Now, I'm no mind reader. I don't know if it was an accident or not, but a significant act of violence and intimidation was perpetrated not by our friends of color, but by someone who's looking to keep the peace. I think as we talk about looting and destruction and the protests, it's so important to make sure that we're seeing the whole story. And I would dare say that on the whole, we've seen demonstrations in almost every single major city in the United States. And on the whole, these are largely peaceful protests. Back in Chrissy's hometown of Pittsburgh, there was a police car set on fire. But in some ways, thank God for these cell phones, right? That was a major act of destruction in their protest. Who was it? An 18-year-old young white man. Sisters and brothers who are worried about destruction in these things, there are bad apples in every crowd, but I wonder how much of this is being instigated by dark forces looking to perpetuate systems of injustice in the world.
And then, Kevin, to add to that, you have to really realize how this affects Black people. How looking at what happened to George Floyd affects Black people. How looking at what happened to Ahmaud Arbery affects Black people. Breonna Taylor affects Black people. Rayshard Brooks affects Black people. They see this time after time after time. And yet and still, in most cases, we don't see any justice. The individuals that do the crime or perpetuate the violence or do something like kill somebody, whatever, they get off. And in most cases, they get off not with a slap on the hand, they just get off, period. So Black people are frustrated. They're angry. They're upset. They want something to be done because, as you indicated last time we were talking, if you talk to your son, you don't really have to talk to him about the police and encountering the police and how to act when you encounter the police. But in the Black community, that's a conversation that Black people have to have all the time with their children, because there's a possibility a call may come in at any time indicating your child has been killed, your child has been arrested, or your child is this. So that's that's real for Black people. And so quite naturally, it's going to cause them to be emotional. Now, there may be 10%, there may be some younger people who may be just outright outraged by something like this, and they may be doing some looting or whatever. But should we focus only on that and not, as you indicated, the larger picture? Should we not look at what caused them to be like that in the first place? And it's simply because they are not being treated as human beings. They're not being treated as citizens of this country, even though they're citizens. They've been emancipated, but yet still, they're still slaves institutionally.
Thank you for using the civil language of our nation, and I'm sure Michael would agree with me as I sit with a bunch of good church folks, as beloved children of God. These are our sisters and brothers who are asking for help. The house is burning down. And what will we do as the Church of Jesus Christ to be his people in these days? Friends, that will be the topic of our next session that will happen next Thursday at 7 o'clock. It will be our final session. And the topic of that session is what does a church like Covenant do to be faithful to the witness of Jesus Christ in this day and age, to walk beside our sisters of color to create a more just, verdant, and peaceful world? Billy Weinstein is asking the question, so it's been 400 years of nonviolent protests, and still here we are, and I dare say that not much has changed. Where do we go from here? Does our language need to become more intense to shake things up? Billy, I think that's a good question. We're going to save it to next week. But I want to give Michael the last word if he has any this evening before we wrap up.
I just want to say again, I want to thank you, Kevin, and I want to thank Covenant Presbyterian Church and the members for the opportunity to be with you all, and for your openness and your willingness to listen to me. I am one person in a whole race of people, and my experience is one thing, but if you really talk to other people, you'll hear much more than what I have shared with you so far. And as Dr. Starcher has indicated, all we are saying is that enough is enough. All we are saying is that it's time for people to open their eyes to the truth. It's time for people to listen to what Black people are saying and not to prejudge what they are saying. And it's time for us to not be complicit in what we are doing, not be complicit in terms of perpetuating systemic racism, because we can do it inadvertently, but to learn about how we can stop it, to learn about how we can dismantle systemic racism, and then come alongside people in the community who are already trying to do the work and to help them to do it faster.
Amen. Michael, once again, thank you for your time spending with us. We know that we're taking away from your family time. Please tell your wife how incredibly grateful we are, and please go this evening with our most sincere gratitude as we all strive to be together to be faithful disciples of Jesus. Michael, blessings. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see everyone again for our final session next week. Grace and peace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you.
Thank you.